Today we will be talking about the space end of crypto and how XRP, XLM, and SHX all tie back into IBM and the individuals that are out of or connected to the PayPal mafia. And of course, how IBM connects into all of the core fintech ISO 222 type of projects and cryptos that I always talk about. And here's where we will get into some content that I don't typically talk about a lot, but I do think it has a lot to do with how a lot of it is interconnected.
With fast, which is essentially the goal there is I think it's super important that people get off the planet and out into the solar system and kind of start expanding where humans can live. Yeah, because basically, if you imagine this world where there's like millions of billions of people living in space, I mean, I think it's like not only is it economically better, like there's a lot of resources up there and energy and stuff that we can harvest, and like it's like like in terms of just like GDP, it's worth it, right? But also I think psychically it's better because people need a frontier, right? We just haven't had a frontier for a very long time because the Earth has been all explored, and if you don't have that, then the world starts feeling very zero sum, and I think just leads to all kinds of like bad outcomes, like with people psychically, like they start thinking about degrowth and like the wars start and all this kind of stuff.
And to just provide a bit of context as to where I am on this, I don't think that any of that is happening for an extremely long time, if it even happens at all. I won't get into my non crypto related ideas here, but there are some obvious issues about the space exploration industry and the success over the last 50 years or so now. Now that we have heard Jed talk about SpaceX and Vast, and because he's tied back into the PayPal mafia and is extremely tied into Elon, Polly thinks that Elon is aware of XLM after shaking hands with Jed, and that he is aware of SHX as well. Now, we have also had some interesting comments out of Elon, and I don't give these too terribly much credence, but it is an interesting note. So on March 14th, we have Elon talking about orbital velocity, which sounds a lot like Velo and Orbit, which is about the same time that we began to hear more about Velo's Orbit app coming out soon. Here we are talking about the logo of Elon's X payments and how that seems to go in line with what XLM looks like now. And here we've the X payments and XLM. And if you look, it seems to go back with the original X.com as well, as shown here. A lot of the individuals with Stellar are tied deeply into the UN, which I don't think is a particularly positive thing in terms of who they are overall. However, we cannot ignore the extreme connections into things like the UN and the WEF and how valuable it is in terms of where these projects are actually headed. So you've got Idris Elba, who is partnered up with Stellar now. You've got Danelle Dixon, who is the CEO. And of course, you have Jed, who is the co-founder and who is also tied into the, I won't say that word on here, trust, which I have talked a little bit before, and how that has some really interesting connections into the whole XLM thing that line up with some of the information here on this map put out by XX. So imagine X integrating Velo to build out the finance side of Elon's Everything app. Orbit is the super app that has QR payments, and the Universe DEX could include trading crypto, commodities, and FX. And it also has a space theme too. So it is an interesting idea. I'm not convinced it'll happen. I think that's a little bit too tangential, but just because it is connected back into the individuals that go back into the PayPal mafia, I don't think that anything is off of the table. All right, here's where I get into the information I was passed along that begins to make a lot of connections here. So, in terms of X, they have been picking up a lot of money transfer licenses, and Ripple has been doing that too. Here we've got some ties into Constellation DAG and Actus, as I have talked about in terms of its connection into Casper primarily. But there is some interesting connections with Pala and Visa that go back into USDC and XLM. Constellation DAG is an interesting one here because it has tons and tons of connections into the US Armed Forces and the Department of Defense, as well as into IBM. And I will come back to DAG in a little bit. Before I do, there is a video that I was told about that talked about the connections in between SpaceX and crypto. And I have come across this, and I think that it's in Spanish, but it does talk about Quant being able to connect all of these different networks, Constellation and its hypergraph, and then how that can connect into all of these other networks and platforms that are connected into IBM and IBM Quantum. So I haven't really talked about Constellation a whole lot, but I do think that it is extremely interesting. And part of that is because they have worked a lot with the Department of Defense. From May of 2023, we have an article. They have achieved scalability, security, and defense approval in executing U.S. Air Force Phase 2 blockchain contract, which uses blockchain to secure an end-to-end data exchange with commercial partners. It paves the way to becoming a federal standard. And it's all about how Constellation is one of the first blockchain companies to ever complete that and receive a government contract on producing a well-defined deliverable prototype. And it has been just about 1 year now, so there is probably a lot more happening that is just not publicly available. We've got a little bit more on Constellation DAG here from December of 2023, where the National Science Foundation funds a DAO to leverage US blockchain technology, powering tokenized voting and solutions. And it is more of a press release about their involvement here, but they are involved in a directive to help drive innovation and establish standards around the use of cryptocurrency and blockchain. Now we get back into Casper a bit, as I called out with its connection into Actus. And in 2021, we have Casper joining IBM's Global Partner Program. And they have worked with IBM a lot, primarily because of IPWE, but also because Casper is working with IBM directly to tokenize the Watson X AI to make it more predictable and to improve quality of its outputs. Coming back to Constellation DAG, here we have an article talking about that contract again. The intention of the project was to develop a way to transfer confidential data securely and more efficiently from government agencies to commercial partners. And that resulted in what Constellation calls the Hypergraph Transfer Protocol, a blockchain replacement for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or what we know as HTTP. And in short, you've got HGTP connected into the Department of Defense and the USAF. But how does all of this come back into SpaceX and XLM? Well, we have the SDA, which is the Space Development Agency, announced the successful launch of a Tranche 0, whatever that means, of the Proliferated Warfighter Space Architecture, which is the transport and tracking layer satellites that will demonstrate low latency communication links to support the warfighter with a resilient network of integrated capabilities, including tracking of advanced missile threats out of LEO. And that went up on a SpaceX rocket, and it is talking about LEO communications, which heavily goes back into what Starlink is all about. And then in September of 2023, we had SpaceX receiving a Pentagon contract to supply military communications, where it looks as if it will leverage the existing Starlink satellites. And here we get into a little bit more about Ripple and XRP, which of course go right back into the PayPal mafia itself. On the ACI Worldwide site, which is a partner with Ripple, you've got them calling out Ripple as the example of distributed ledger technology in relation to Swift. And I have talked about this a lot, but SHX is also extremely connected into IBM, as WorldWire was incorporating Stellar and Stronghold. And the interesting thing is that there are certain individuals who are connected into Stronghold that are pretty friendly with Elon Musk out of SpaceX and PayPal. So here you've got David Sachs, who comes out of Duro Advisors, who are involved with a lot of high-end venture capital, and who has been behind companies such as Palantir and SpaceX. And he also came out of PayPal. Here we get into a little bit more of the technological connections and the space kind of connections, but we are talking about NASA blockchain on satellites. And it says here, with the thrust towards multi-sensor satellite architectures, such as constellations, new technologies are required to enable transition to this future capability. And I just thought it was interesting that Constellation is talked about here, because Constellation DAG is involved with the Department of Defense. Here it is talking about how nodes, which contain both the DLT as well as the logic that defines how different transactions should be processed. And then we get a little bit more conspiratorial in terms of involvement with the X payments and X as it relates back into things like XLM and XRP and crypto overall. So the whole thing about Circle is that the logo has been closing off for a while now, and that is hypothesized to be reflective of how close we are to things actually happening. I talked about this a bit more at the beginning of this content, but there is a connection with Stripe, XLM, and Google X, and Project Tara, as it relates back to a few people out of the PayPal mafia. We have an article from July of 2014 that talks about how Stripe was helping to create XLM, and they invested a lot into that up front. Here we have other ties into Google X with relation to Moonshot Factory and X Prize. In his interview with Elon, you can see that in there, and it relates to Astrostellar. So you've got Moonshot right here, and some tongue in cheek talk here with a connection into X. Here is more on Project Tara, which is Google's new attempt to offer internet to everyone, which was from 2021. And if you just look at that right there, it kind of looks like what Starlink has turned into. And it looks like it is a project that is trying to use fiber optic technology to retransmit light over water, allowing a connectivity where it was not possible before. So I'm not sure on this article. It did have to be translated, so it is interesting. Here you've got head of payment products at Ripple alongside Google and NASA, which I do have some content that to connect XRP and SHX into Google in a way that I think will surprise a lot of people. The cost of maintaining the legacy system is around 1.6 trillion. That has an error rate in failed payments of 6%. I haven't seen anyone tie this into IBM, but there is a tie NVIDIA and GPU graphics cards. And as we are talking about the connections into the Department of Defense and everything, I think that a lot of people might be over what kind of involvement things like render can have. And that is mainly because of the kinds of technologies that render is and will be able to help develop as GPU computing becomes even more and more important. And if anyone has been questioning current events for any extended amount of time at all, I think it's obvious how a technology like we are able to see here could be helpful in the geopolitical and military applications.